The BMAT, or the BioMedical Admissions Test, is an entrance test used here in the UK for entry to undergraduate medicine by Oxford, Cambridge, UCL and Imperial College London. So if you're thinking of applying to any of these for medicine, you'll have to take the BMAT. The BMAT's a 2-hour-long test which is broken down into 3 separate sections. The first one is aptitude and skills, which is critical thinking, reason and logic, and you're given 60 minutes to answer 35 questions. The second section is half an hour long, and you have to answer 27 questions, and it's about scientific knowledge and application. And unlike the UK CAT, you're not allowed a calculator in this. The third section is an essay writing section where you get to choose from 4 titles, an essay to answer. You have to analyse an argument and construct a coherent essay around it, basically. And so yeah, those are the 3 sections. So let's move on to aptitude and skills. With 60 minutes to answer 35 questions, that's just under 2 minutes per question, and you might think that's really generous, but trust me, it's not. If anything, the BMAT is even more time pressured than UK CAT. It's the hardest entrance test I've ever done, and I definitely thought it was harder than the UK CAT. In the first section, you can be asked any of 3 types of questions: problem solving, understanding arguments, and data analysis. And these will all test your ability to analyse information, get conclusions from them, be able to tell which information is relevant and which information isn't, and put all that together into a coherent answer within that time limit. You need to be really careful with this section because you'll get things that say which is the most logical conclusion from this information. So you might have lots of conclusions that make sense, but you have to choose the one that's the most logical, which might trip people up if they don't notice it. Another thing they might say is what assumption has to be made to support the last line of this paragraph, and things like that. Or in the data inference part, you'll be given bigger amounts of information, maybe even with a chart, table or a graph, and lots of text, and then asked to answer 6 questions on it. And these can be particularly difficult if you don't understand the text, so take the time to read it properly and really understand it whilst keeping in mind the very short amount of time you do have. It might seem like it's impossible to revise for this section of the test, and it can be difficult, but it's not impossible. I've been told that if you do critical thinking, that can be helpful because it's all about studying the structure and the logic of arguments, which is especially useful for for understanding arguments part of section 1. Another good resource might be to read articles online and see if you can critique journalists' arguments and their conclusions. See if they've made any assumptions. For example, an article might be criticising the fact that GPs make too much money, then cite the fact that 2 individuals earn over 200,000. But they may have falsely assumed in that applies to the majority of GPs. So it's little things like this, noticing when things follow from a given statement and noticing when they don't follow, noticing implicit and explicit assumptions when they're said and when they're not. For revision for this, I recommend a book that's similar to the 600 questions book for the UK CAT, but it's called the 400 questions book for the BMAT, which is absolutely great. So recommend that wholeheartedly for this. A final note on this, and this doesn't just apply to this section, it applies to the entire test. Don't be disheartened if at first you're getting scores like 3 point something or 4s or anything like that. The majority of people on the actual test get around about 50%. And when you think about it, the people that are applying to these 4 universities are probably very, very good applicants anyway, and if they're getting 50% on this test, that means it's hard. So don't be disheartened if you're getting lower scores at first. With practice, they will improve. If you did all the sciences to A-level, then it's in the second section of the BMAT that this might help you. If not, then don't worry, you'll just have to go back to GCSE and revise a fair bit. Because the content of the second section of the BMAT is GCSE standard, but the application is a lot harder. So if you ever had any of these old books, these CGP ones, for biology, for chemistry, for physics and for maths, whack them out and revise as much as you can from them. Use textbooks and just revise all of GCSE science and maths, because that's the content for the second section. It's worth noting that I reckon the time constraints for this section of the BMAT are the worst of all the 3 sections. In my test, I started the second section and I was about half done and I thought I was in good time. I looked up and I had about 5 minutes left, so I was forced to rush the second half and guess some answers, which is not really an ideal situation you want to find yourself in. I think a bit of guessing is inevitable, but time management is absolutely key for this. You have to be quick, you have to be on the ball, you have to know your stuff so you can get things out of the way really quickly. If you find yourself stuck on some for more than a minute or so, then just either skip it, or guess it, or just... I don't think it's worth coming back to it unless you haven't spent more than a minute on it. Guessing is a good rule because you're not negatively marked. You'll need to do a few practice papers to see what I mean with this, because first time round you do it, you might do some and think, okay, this is alright, but then realise you went way over the time limit like I did. To keep inside the time limit and actually have a good attempt at the questions is really, really difficult. So for this section of the BMAT, be up to date on your knowledge, manage your time really well and be quick, and you should be okay, hopefully. Now for section 3, the essay question. For this section, as with most exams, planning is absolutely key. You might find it really easy to write an essay in half an hour, or you might find it really difficult. For me, this was the easiest section of 3, though not easy, because I'd taken English literature at AS and we'd done lots of practice essays in class where there was a time limit of half an hour, so I was used to writing an essay under those kind of time conditions. I was, however, pretty unfamiliar with just how meticulously your answer needs to be laid out, so that was something I had to learn for this. If you're the kind of person that's really good with numbers and science but that are rubbish at writing essays, then it's really worth putting in some time improving this part of the BMAT. It's a good idea to organise your answer into sections because there's a mark given on the mark scheme for addressing every part of the question. So you are given an extra sheet where you can plan things, it's blank, and you can write things like paragraph 1, address this part of the question, these ideas, say this, carry on like this, paragraph 2, so on and so forth. Introductions and conclusions, I think, are not necessary. You can do them if you want to, but they might waste space. So if you do them, make them short and concise. It's all about planning and being clear. To give you all an idea of some of the questions that come up, I'm going to read out the questions that came up on last year's paper, which is the one that I sat. So you answer one of these 4 questions. The first one is, democratic freedom means there should be no restriction on what may be said in public. Explain what you think democratic freedom means. Argue that there should be restrictions on what's said in public. To what extent do you agree that there should be limitations on what can be said in public? So like I said before, you need to address every part of this question, otherwise you miss a key mark on the mark scheme. So you have to explain what you think democratic freedom means. Then you have to argue that there should be restrictions on what's said in public. Then you have to go on to say to what extent you agree that there should be limitations on what can be said in public. Second question is, the art of medicine consists of amusing patients while nature cures the disease, which is a quote from Voltaire. Explain what this statement means. Argue to the contrary that medicine does in fact do more than amuse the patient. To what extent do you think Voltaire is correct? Same drill as before. Question number 3, which is the one that I picked, was, a scientific man ought to have no wishes, no affections, a mere heart of stone, which is a quote from Darwin. And subtext, explain what this statement means. Argue that scientific inquiry benefits from personal wishes and affections. To what extent do you think a scientist should have a mere heart of stone? I chose this one because my knowledge was the most relevant to it. I knew more about Charles Darwin than I did Voltaire, and I didn't really want to speak about democracy for the first question. And the fourth question was, veterinary pet care in the UK should be free at the point of delivery as human care is, and then some more subtext on that. You can see that on the cambridgeassessment.org.uk website. But I picked the Darwin question because I knew of the inner struggle he faced when he was writing The Origin of Species, how everyone around him was quite religious at the time, and to make a statement that evolution was the way we grew and came about would be to go in the face of everything that everyone around him believed. So in this sense, he had to have a mere heart of stone and ignore his emotions and his feelings on the matter, but just look at the facts. So that's what I did for that one. It was a little bit more coherent when I wrote it at the time, but anyway. A good way to prepare for this one is to just write practice essays. Actually print out the paper you're given for the actual exam so you can get an idea of just how much space you're given for the essay, and make sure you write within the space limitations and the time limitations. Both of those are self-explanatory really. And after you've done a couple of those, perhaps get your friends to look over them, maybe an English teacher if you can get your hands on one, to mark it for you. And with marking in mind, I'll move on to how each individual section is marked. Alright, so on to how it's marked. Each of the first two sections is given a score out of 9, with 9 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. For section 1, out of 35, if you score 3 or less, you get a score of 1. Graduating upwards, it goes 6 is a score of 2, 8, 3, 12, 4, 17, 5, 21, 6, 25, 7, 29, 8, 31 or more is a 9. And what's worth noting is that you don't need 100% in the actual thing to get the highest mark there is. But if you do get 31 or more and get a 9, you're a genius. You're among the bottom couple of percent of people who do that well. Hardly anyone does that well. It's the same for the second question, and you need 23 out of 27 to get a 9. But again, you have to be very, very good to do that. The third section is marked quite differently. You're given 2 marks. One is from 1 to 5 for the quality of the essay, 5 being the best and 1 being the worst, and 1 is for quality of English, which is from A to E, A being the best. Most people for the quality of English generally get A's because they can write clearly and coherently. It's really if you're making kind of serious mistakes, like things that just don't follow, you're not writing fluently, you're making spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, that you'll drop into the C's and below. But hopefully after a practice essay or 2 that shouldn't happen. Quality of the essay, on the other hand, is quite difficult. A 5 is really good. 4 is very good, and 3 is quite good, but bordering on average. 2 and 1 are below average. But to get a good score on this, you just need to make sure you answer all parts of the question, and make sure that your arguments are clear and concise. And that's all I can say really for the marking. Get the 400 questions book to read a little bit more about it. Before I end the video, I'll just mention how the universities use them. Oxford puts emphasis differently depending on which section. It puts 40% on section 1, 40% on section 2, and 20% on section 3. That's how the weighting is carried out. So they don't mind as much about the third section. Cambridge doesn't really have a universal policy on it, but it differs from college to college. It might be worth checking the websites or ringing them up to ask, because some are a little more demanding than others. Imperial, asked last year, had a cut-off score of about 4.9, 4.9, 2.5C, respectively, for sections 1, 2 and 3, and people with those scores or above were called for interview, and the vast majority of people with scores below were just rejected straight off. UCL has a similar policy, I think. They look at each section individually, but I'm not quite sure if it's as high as the others. I think it's similar to Imperial's. If you're interested, my own score was 5.2 in the first section, 5.8 in the second, and then a 4A in the last one. And those scores were enough to get me interviews at Imperial and Cambridge, but I do know people who got 4.9s in section 1 and 2, who got interviews at Imperial and then went on to get in, and similarly I know people with lower scores who had interviews at Cambridge and then went on to get in as well. So while it is a really important factor, especially for Imperial I think because they use a cut-off thing, it's not always the be-all and end-all. One last thing to mention. You take the BMAT on the 3rd of November, which is after you send off your application. So it might be risky applying to 1 or even 2 BMAT universities, because if you sent off your application and then you screw up the BMAT and they use a cut-off, then you might have already chucked 1 or 2 choices in the bin, and given that you're only allowed 4 choices for medicine, that could well be half your application gone over one test. So be careful about which universities you choose. I was a bit risky probably in choosing 2 BMAT universities, but thankfully it ended up paying off. My reasoning was, if I take 2 BMAT and 2 UK CAT, and if I screw up one of the tests, I'll still have the others to rely on. But take into consideration that the BMAT, in my opinion, is a lot harder, so make your choices carefully. I know this video has been a bit long, but I hope it's helped you. If you got any questions, just comment and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.